There's criminal invaders marching to the border. They're going to take your jobs and get food stamps. The barbarians are at the gates. Call out the National Guard. Secure the border. Build a wall. In the name of all that is good and holy, build a wall. So, I'd like to say that my intro was gross exaggeration, a spoof of current discourse on the issue. And to a certain extent it is, but not to nearly the extent that it should be in a reasonable society. In fact, these ravings are not far off from what really is being said about the so-called Refugee Caravan. After all, the President of the United States himself has referred to the caravan as an invasion against which the United States must defend itself.
At this very moment, large, well-organized caravans of migrants are marching toward our southern border. Some people call it an invasion. It's like an invasion. They have violently overrun the Mexican border. You saw that 2 days ago. These are tough people in many cases. A lot of young men, strong men, and a lot of men that maybe we don't want in our country, but again...
According to the president and his supporters, the migrant caravan is chock full of criminals and unknown Middle Easterners. Wait. Unknown Middle Easterners? What does that even mean? I mean, if they're unknown, how do you know they're Middle Easterners? And even if they are Middle Easterners, what difference does that make? Why associate them with criminals? Oh yeah, good old-fashioned racism and bigotry. Sorry I asked. Anyway, by defining the caravan as an invasion, a definition that has military connotations, the president can justify a military response. The president has stationed 5,000 armed soldiers to the southern border with plans to raise that amount to 15,000. 15,000 heavily armed American soldiers is being mobilized against an unarmed caravan of about 7,000 people who are as yet still 2 months away from the border. And, wait, what? What, you're kidding me? Jeez. So it seems that for some Americans, 15,000 heavily armed American soldiers isn't quite enough. Some self-appointed armed citizen militias are also going down to help secure the border. What could possibly go wrong? So this is either the most pathetic, cowardly expression of paranoia at the highest levels of government, or it's a cynical attempt to stoke an equally pathetic expression of cowardice on the part of the Trump-supporting base in advance of the midterm elections. Either way, it's hard to get around the whole cowardice and paranoia foundations. But what's behind this fear? A big part of it is just right-wing propaganda. We've already seen this in action with the Mad Sociologist news feature on MS-13. The American right conjures fear and paranoia from its base by presenting the other as an imminent threat to the nation. For instance, the propagandists on Fox News have already perpetrated the rumor without evidence that the migrants are carrying diseases like smallpox, leprosy, and tuberculosis. Smallpox and leprosy? Really? Really? This is reminiscent of the same arguments made by the know-nothings about my great-grandparents who migrated to the United States at the turn of the century. Because, diseased people always walk thousands of miles in order to confront hostile militias, police, and military personnel with the hope of finding themselves relegated to a refugee camp for months. Now that's a health plan. The refugee caravan is also linked with criminals. Of course, MS-13 is the go-to boogeyman here, but generalizations are also made. There's no actual evidence that anyone in the caravan is a criminal. But when it comes to defending one's right to be considered innocent till proven guilty, conservatives are on the front lines. Just not if you're one of, those people. If you're a right-wing Supreme Court nominee accused of sexual assault, you're innocent till proven guilty. Poor brown person from another country? Not so much. Realistically, if you were a criminal, would you take it upon yourself to walk 1,000 miles risking arrest every step of the way just to commit crimes in another country? Or would you stay where you are and commit your crimes at home where your networks are? Joining a caravan of refugees is simply not a sound strategy for criminals. That may explain why, statistically speaking, immigrants, even undocumented immigrants, have much lower crime rates than do natural-born citizens. Now, there was exactly one incident at the Mexican-Guatemalan border in which some caravan members threw bottles at the Mexican police. this one incident is being presented in the right-wing media as proof positive that there are criminal elements among the prospective refugees. Indeed, these bottle throwers represent such a danger to our society that we must send 15,000 armed soldiers and the Yahoo militia to defend the country. Those must be some pretty impressive bottles. A little context might be in order. See, one incident of bottle throwing is not evidence of inherent criminality. People in large groups under desperate circumstances may act out when the circumstances are right. In this case, the Mexican police were trying to block the caravan from crossing the border. A police official admitted that officers at the scene taunted the refugees by making fun of their flag. Under these circumstances, is it unusual for a few people out of thousands to have mishandled themselves and thrown some bottles? Well, bottle throwers are so scary to our president that he's announced the policy that throwing bottles would be considered the equivalent of firing upon our soldiers. Just today, in fact, the New York Times reported that the Nigerian forces used Trump's announced policy to justify gunning down as many as 40 protesters. So news is spreading fast. And just in case bottle throwing doesn't scare you enough, we'll also sprinkle on this paranoia cake some nice sweet references to terrorism by just referencing Middle Easterners. That's it. Nothing in particular, just Middle Easterners. You know, the right isn't even trying in this case. The bigotry is just gratuitous. And in case the time-tested strategy of associating immigrants with criminality, violence, and disease was not enough, there's always the ultimate paranoid construct. That's right, George Soros. Yes, if you want to motivate fear in the right-wing base, you invoke the specter of George Soros. It wasn't long after the suggestion that this caravan was really a political stunt coordinated by the Democratic Party ahead of the midterms was suggested, before reports spread throughout social media that the migrant caravan was actually a well-funded political spectacle devised by none other than the billionaire Democratic donor George Soros. Psst! He's also a foreigner, and one of those, Jews. The hate-mongering has had its impact. Just sign on to social media right now. It won't take long for you to find a reactionary rant on the Refugee Caravan close to the top of your street. The rhetoric even inspired a wacko in Pittsburgh to shoot up a synagogue. In essence, the right is pulling out all of the stops in order to halt this Soros-led Jewish conspiracy to corral a bunch of malnourished Middle Eastern criminal lepers and march them 1,000 miles where, armed with bottles, they'll invade the United States, take our jobs, collect food stamps, and vote for socialized medicine. Well, now you're making this sound ridiculous. The fact is, this caravan is not some deep, dark conspiracy to invade America or make the Republican Party look bad or whatever. When you analyze migration patterns, the first thing you should do is look at the push and pull factors. In this case, the push factors are obvious. Poverty and violence. 3 countries fueling the caravan, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, are among the top 10 nations for violent crime. They're also among the poorest nations in the hemisphere. People are desperate to protect themselves and their children from the roving gangs who threaten to kill, rape, kidnap, or even coerce people into joining. Historically, those who wanted to escape these conditions had to call upon individuals called coyotes to help them make the dangerous trek across Mexico and over the American border. These coyotes were often unscrupulous, dangerous criminals who charged a lot of money and often didn't deliver, or worse, victimized the migrants. In this case, however, a group of people banded together to make the trip collectively because there was security in numbers. As they traveled, more and more people who share the same hopes of a better life joined them. The caravan grew to thousands. In fact, there's more than one caravan making the journey, each apparently inspired by the one before. The pull factors are quite obvious. The United States represents more stability and economic opportunity, and the migrants are not wrong about this. The United States has about 1/20th the murder rate of Honduras, and about 1/4 the murder rate of Mexico, the next obvious destination for Honduran immigrants. The United States also has a record low unemployment rate, with many businesses looking for workers, especially those businesses with difficult, low-paying jobs. Many American businesses are hurting and uncertain in the face of Trump's immigration plan. Even in the worst of times, Americans did not want the kind of agricultural and factory labor taken by immigrants. Today, with jobs relatively easy to get, there's no way Americans will fill these jobs. They're too arduous and too low paying. There is a demand for the type of labor that immigrants provide. The standard response to this is, okay, but why can't they come in legally and wait in line like everyone else? After all, my ancestors came here legally. Well, all right, this is really loaded. First, they are coming legally. It is perfectly legal for refugees to enter the country and ask for asylum according to the United Nations 1951 Convention and the UN 1967 Protocols and Resolution 2198. The United States coded all of this into law in the 1980 Refugee Act. Members of the caravan are not breaking any laws by crossing the border. Secondly, when you're fearing for your life, waiting years for your name to pop up in a green card lottery is simply not reasonable. The United States limits the number of immigrants from each country and fills its spots through a lottery. Some people waiting for legal residency in the United States wait decades before their name is pulled. Finally, I can't speak for how everyone's ancestors came into the United States, but if they entered before the 1920s and they weren't Chinese, there were no quotas. The border was pretty close to open to Europeans with the exception of an entrance interview and physical examination. And the southern border was very porous. Migrants crossed the southern border into the United States largely unchecked. Even when the United States was close to going to war with Mexico. Even when Pancho Villa was literally conducting cross-border raids in the United States. The next argument is, okay, but why is it our responsibility to take all of these refugees? Just because their countries are a mess, that's not our fault. Well, there are two reasonable responses to this argument. One is a fairly moderate argument, and the other is a bit more radical. The moderate argument is, it's our responsibility because helping people who need help is morally right. It's the right thing to do according to almost every single ethical principle in the world, with the possible exception of Ayn Rand objectivism. The more radical response is actually, it is our fault that these nations are a mess. The United States has a long history of interfering in the domestic affairs of Central and South American nations. In the mid-19th century, American land speculators called filibusters endeavored to spread the concept of manifest destiny into the South. That's right, manifest destiny wasn't just about claiming the lands in the West. The goal was to get all of it, mostly for the benefit of Southern slave owners. The most notorious of these filibusters was William Walker. Walker actually conquered and held territory in Mexico for a while before being driven out. He then traveled to Nicaragua, where he took advantage of a political crisis to take control of the country. The resulting conflict drew in Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Honduras into the fray. This movement was followed by larger, more powerful American business interests. In Nicaragua, Cornelius Vanderbilt owned vast tracts of land on which he built a transit company, delivering goods and travelers from the Caribbean to the Pacific. After all, there was no Panama Canal at the time. It was a hugely successful endeavor, but that wealth didn't stay in Nicaragua. It went to Cornelius Vanderbilt's banks in New York. Among the largest American businesses in Central America was United Fruit, owning huge holdings for mostly bananas. The business plan of United Fruit and other U.S. companies in the region was to sponsor and support brutal tin-horn dictators who would support company goals, namely turning a blind eye to company practices and guaranteeing low-wage labor. When popular anger in the regions became too hot to handle, American businesses could always rely on the United States military for support. Between 1890 and 1930, the United States military was involved in numerous military interventions and occupations in Central America, known to the rest of the world as the Banana Wars. The result was the establishment of banana republics, presided over by these tin-horn dictators who would support U.S. business interests. Later, the CIA was implicated in covert operations that silenced dissent and stifled discontent in Central America while continuing to support often brutal regimes. This includes, but certainly not limited to, the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in the interests of the United Fruit Company. Support for regressive regimes continues in the region. Most recently and relevantly, the United States at least tacitly supported the overthrow of democratically elected and popular reformer Manuel Zelaya in 2009. That's right. Can't blame this one on Trump. This was Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Now, both condemned the coup, but neither really did anything about it. They did nothing to alter the outcome, and in fact, they intervened in Zelaya's planned return to Nicaragua. The leader of the coup, General Romeo Vasquez Velasquez, was a graduate of the little-known but notorious School of the Americas. This was a training ground for brutal counterinsurgents, responsible for putting down popular uprisings throughout Central and South America. Their main tactic was slaughter and torture. The School of the Americas is now now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. I often hear the argument, well, why can't those people fix their own country? Yeah, those people is a recurring theme in these debates. Well, there are larger economic forces devised by the current world system that act to impede economic development in Central America, often to the benefit of the United States and American business interests. First is a trade agreement known as CAFTA, or the Central American Free Trade Agreement. CAFTA lowered tariffs between trade partners, including the United States, and was sold as a way to help Central American economies grow as they get access to foreign capital and investment. And this did happen. Gross domestic product in member nations has increased significantly, but at a cost to local economies. For instance, American farmers can produce more efficiently than Central American farmers. Because of the low tariffs, American crops are then dumped onto the Central American economy, causing a trade imbalance in agricultural products. As American agriculture outcompetes regional agriculture, agricultural workers and local farmers are forced to leave the land. They make their way to urban centers in search of work. This drives down the value of labor in urban markets, further immiserating the poor, reducing the tax base while increasing the demand for services, creating public sector deficits. To get help from this downward spiral, developing countries must turn to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for loans. This sounds good until you look at the details. The World Bank and the IMF only make loans in dollars, and the United States, specifically the Federal Reserve, has the monopoly on dollars. These debts must be paid back in dollars, so Central American countries, having received loans from the IMF, must encourage American businesses to come into their countries so they can get access to American dollars that are then turned back over to the United States in the form of loan repayments. This means selling off public goods, deregulating markets, denationalizing nationalized industries, and deregulating the environment, leading to further degradation of all of these things. Furthermore, this strengthens the dollar against the local currencies, making it more difficult to pay back the loans. In essence, the world system is set up to instigate a massive wealth transfer from less developed countries like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, all through Central America, to the United States. So with this in mind, the refugee caravan can be seen as labor simply following the wealth transfer, following the capital. In our current world system, however, wealth can be transferred much more easily than can people. Can we claim to have free markets if labor is less free than capital? If wealth can cross borders with more freedom than can people? I don't think so. Where you have legitimate markets that are closed to and exploitative of the population, you increase the demand for participation in illegitimate markets or black markets. In Central America, that's the drug trade and human trafficking. The black market in Central America is exacerbated by the amount of guns, many of which are from the United States. In 2017 alone, the United States exported over $300 million worth of guns to Honduras. It was over $500 million in Guatemala, a mere $250 million in tiny El Salvador. We also have a bunch of well-trained paramilitaries hanging around, many of whom were trained by American forces. The U.S. War on drugs only exacerbates the problem by making the drug trade more lucrative. Look, these problems are impossibly complex, but the United States has played a role in creating the push factors contributing to the refugee crisis. But it's also important to understand that the refugees fleeing Central America are just one corner of a larger global crisis, According to Oxfam, there are over 65.5 million people displaced due to violence, persecution, and human rights violations. If the displaced were their own country, it would be larger than the United Kingdom. This is the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and half of those displaced are less than 18 years old. All over the world, advanced nations must deal with millions of refugees who are looking for stability. The causes of this crisis are complex and varied. Some of it has to do with a world system that has largely benefited the very nations beset by refugees. Some of it has to do with geopolitical power plays and blowback. An increasing amount of the crisis has to do with global climate change. Some of the blame can be laid on Americans and other advanced nations. Some of it is just the vicissitudes of history. Who's at fault is less important than what can be done about it. The solutions to this crisis will be as varied and complex as the causes. One thing is for sure, building walls and sending in the army is not the solution. If migration is motivated by push factors and pull factors, and we know that it is, then policies for securing the border are doomed to fail from the start. Securing the border, creating a fortress mentality, creating concentration camps for children, does nothing to address either the push factors or the pull factors. As reported by the New York Times, many of the refugees in the caravan know that they may be facing armed resistance when they get to the border. They know that their children may be taken away from them. But they're willing to take the risk because conditions in their home countries are even worse than the conditions they face crossing the U.S. border. Many have reported that they're banking on Trump backing off of his anti-immigration policies and rants once the caravan arrives at the border. Good luck with that. The bottom line is that millions of human beings are hurting. And if we put our heads together and respond with reason and science and humility, we can bring much needed relief to the most desperate among us. If we act based on the recognition of collective humanity, that we're all travelers on this increasingly integrated and interconnected world, we might just improve the world for everyone. But we can't even begin to address the real issues, to formulate real solutions, when our leadership is too busy stoking fear of the other, and a significant part of our population is paralyzed with tribal paranoia. Moral cowardice solves nothing. Our technology is integrated and networked all over the world. Human interaction with the environment has global implications. Our economies consist of global commodity chains. We're culturally integrated in ways that we've never been before, and will become increasingly so as history progresses. We've reached a point in our history where rejecting the humanity of the most desperate among us dehumanizes us all. We've reached a point in our history where human civilization is impossible if we do not recognize the connections to and responsibilities for the greater human tribe. If we're to come together at this time of increasing global peril for human civilization, we must reject the petty tribes we've allied ourselves with, especially those regressive tribes that seek empowerment at the expense of others.